Today we're talking about disengaged or disillusioned, how culture and ethics fuel or fights fraud. Now, thank you very much for giving up an hour of your time. I know there's lots of content out there, so for you to give up time for us today is really nice of you, and we're grateful. And hopefully you can take something out of this today. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Aaron Chauhan. I'm a director and I lead this law firm, Tenet. We're a law firm that specialises in disputes, investigations, and risk advisory compliance work around fraud and financial crime. The aim of the Coalface episode is really to talk to people who are at the front line dealing with issues around fraud and financial crime, and one of those issues is governance, which is why we're talking about culture today. Previous episodes we are going to post in the chat by my colleague Paula. There's examples of, we talked about ESG and fraud, investigative journalism, cyber, the US perspective on white collar crime. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Perrin Carey of CoSteer. He's the founder of CoSteer. We met online, I think, Perrin, through possibly COVID, where we're talking about culture and behavioural science. I've kept a keen interest in Perrin and CoSteer's work. So, Perrin, maybe a sort of introduction from yourself.
Lovely. Thanks, Aaron, and thank you to everybody for your time today. It's lovely to be here. CoSteer is a human technology business. It's designed to observe and understand the humanity within organizations. And in the process of doing that, we utilize AI and machine learning. So it sounds like a bit of a paradox, this idea of going against the grain of the current movement of making organizations more human by utilizing AI to understand them. And we look through the lenses of culture, governance, and really, how can we understand the systems in which that organization is operating? Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Perrin. Well, it's going to be good to dive into this. We've had a good registration today, 160 people registered for either joining us live or they're going to hopefully watch it back. Indicates the value of the role of culture, I think, in many people watching. I've also got my big sister who's joined from Australia. I don't think she's joined one of our sessions before. So hello, Diddy. Hope you're okay. And thank you, everyone. Just the other housekeeping, we have motion-centered lights here, so I seem to do some weird dance everywhere in every one of these sessions where I'm waving my arms around to get the lights back on, so apologies if you see that happen. The structure of today's, as you've seen from the setup, we tend to talk through 5 broad topics at the Coalface webinars for about 45, 50 minutes or so, and then a few minutes left for Q&A. So the 5 topics Perrin and I are going to kind of delve through are call it culture. It's what your people do around here when nobody's watching. That's what people think about culture. But I'm interested in culture about how it can help your people be your eyes and ears when it comes to looking out for the risk of fraud. We're going to talk about the silence trap. It's why we should not assume silence equals compliance and why we need to do more around ensuring this engagement. What does governance really look like as our 3rd topic? It's going beyond controls and procedures and policies, looking at clarity of purpose and helping avoid things like risk fatigue. We're going to look at where fraud starts. Often it starts with a small deception, a just in a once moment or once in a time moment. So we're going to discuss ethical drift and how can people who are ostensibly good people do bad things. And then we're going to bridge theory and practice. We're going to talk about some real world case studies, takeaway on how you can increase transparency, embed culture as a kind of a leading way of prevention, and close the gap between kind of lived values and behaviour. So getting into it. So last week I was actually in your neck of the woods, Perrin, in the Channel Islands, presenting at a conference on fraud and corporate liability and leadership. And one of the other speakers was a brilliant speaker called Paul Maskell from UK Finance. And he does a great talk around emotion and fraud. And he says, when you think of fraud, what image comes to mind? And nobody can have an image that comes to mind when you automatically think about fraud. Maybe someone with a swag bag, with a stripy top running away. He says you can't, and that's the problem with fraud prevention, is people can't visualize the threat. And I was thinking ahead of this session, what's the same with culture? How can we advocate for something that we can't visualize? So in your view, what is it that makes and describes culture? What are we actually talking about today?
Goodness. Okay, that's a massive question to begin with, right?
We'll use the whole hour. It's okay.
Okay. The pithiest definition that I've ever heard of culture comes from Seth Godin, and he simply says, "People like us do things like this."
Yeah.
which kind of begs two questions for us, right? Who are we, and what do we do, right? And it's kind of trying to looking at this idea of saying, who are we? What are our values? What's our purpose? What do we represent? What are our beliefs? You know, what are the things that we stand for? Yeah, people like us. So we gather together with people like us. But you're not going to gather together just for the sake of gathering together, right? You're going to gather together because you want to do something. So people like us do things like this. So what is it that we gather together to do? How do we behave? What are our moral positions on various things? How do we act on those moral positions? How do we make choices? What choices do we make? How consistent are we with those choices? And then how do we move from not just making a choice, but then actually actioning that choice, that decision? So the pithiest, the shortest definition I've got, people like us do things like this, and then you can unpick that to your heart's content. A visualization, I guess, looking in the background, right? Looking behind me here, we've not through no coincidence, right? We've got this murmuration of starlings. A beautiful example of culture in kind of synchronicity, in unity, in flow, constantly moving, constantly adapting, constantly changing, often with what appears to be a lack of sense of purpose, but actually if you unpick the biology, there's lots to it. So visually, culture probably looks like what it looks like behind me. But if you're a words person, people like us do things like this.
That's really nice. I think, there's something about that though, about how you maintain that consistency of culture. I know it can be the bedrock of an organization. When prepping for all of these kind of the Coalface sessions, I tend to find quotes and things like that. And I read about this iceberg model by an anthropologist called Edward T. Hall. And he said the iceberg analogy, which I think is used in many kind of different ways in life, is if iceberg represents the organization, a large proportion of that iceberg is underwater, and that's your culture. It's the thing that is a constant, keeps you afloat, keeps you operating in a good organization. Now, my view in relation to the context of fraud is that if individuals of an organization hold each other accountable via their beliefs and principles, that culture is going to instill this environment where your people will be your eyes and ears. But not only that, they'll look around the corners for you on what's coming, where those who are busy running an organization can't see it. Do you buy into that? Do you see culture as another control or another route to protecting an organization?
I would say the answer is both yes and no, and you have to hold them in unison. I think that culture is something which is emergent, consistently changing and moving. And actually, if you look through the lens of organizations being complex, and we can touch on what I precisely mean by that in a minute, then I would say that in fact, culture is incredibly difficult to predict and control. As a consequence, anything that culture impacts is therefore incredibly difficult to predict and control, which actually makes every organization difficult to predict and control. But, and I hold this big but, which is why it's a yes and a no. So there's my no, but where's my yes? My yes is because just because you can't control and predict doesn't mean that you can't actively and intelligently participate in culture as a system. And I think this is where maybe it's a slightly different iceberg model. All right, I'm going to very quickly share my screen because it's easier to illustrate. Easier to illustrate this than I'm going to. Oh, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. Let me just. We can come back to that in a moment. There we go. Here we go. So very quickly. So I just make my slide a little bit bigger if I can. Hopefully you guys can see that. So it's a bit like an iceberg, right? So it's showing a bit that's underwater. And when we normally approach challenges and problems within businesses, we are so accustomed to approaching these problems from the perspective of linearity. If I input this, that will happen. And this is the fundamental basis by which we implement policies, procedures, controls, right? If I put in this process, then I can predict and control what's going to happen next. But actually, culture is everything that's below the waterline here. It's an incredibly interconnected, complex, unpredictable, uncontrollable environment. And therefore, in order to unpick how can we approach this as a yes to that question, we have to begin to understand the unpredictability and how do we actually participate in that. And it's what many people call a kind of wicked problem. And this is what we've been doing for the last decade, really, is trying to understand that wicked problem. How can we understand culture as this system that we're going to participate in to maximize the benefit of that system towards the outcomes of the organization? And that is to mitigate risk and maximize opportunity, right? And one of those risks is fraud.
And, you said there that, if culture is difficult to predict and control, but you have everyone participating, I suppose, in culture. If everyone's swimming in the same direction and they're part of that culture, that's got to take a little bit of the unpredictability out. And once it also, so I guess where I come from is when I'm advocating, when I'm, I guess, doing some training for leadership teams or alike, or boards, I'm talking about how setting that culture can influence preventing fraud, but also it steers towards increasing profitability if everyone's swimming in the same direction. Do you think that's the big byproduct of culture, or is the return you get from your people?
I think yes. Culture can have an impact on overall performance of an organization. And when we say, and I'll just sort of, when you talk about people swimming in the same direction, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone necessarily agreeing with each other, and this kind of culture of kind of cognitive unity, right? What we actually want is people challenging which direction we're swimming in, all right, all of the time. Are we actually swimming in the direction we should be swimming in? And so culture is more than just everyone following everyone else. It is, in fact, more than just starlings and murmuration. You do need central purpose. You need, some people call it a North Star. You do need strategic aims. You do need sets of values, because human beings cluster and group around those ideas, around those elements within organizations. And this is why, for example, in governance frameworks and others around the world, corporate purpose is emerging as a central theme within those frameworks. So trying to link it back to what you're saying around individual choices, do people's individual choices become more controllable and predictable as a consequence of a more unified culture? I think yes is the answer, but then it depends upon what's the nature of that culture. Because you could argue, actually, well, a culture of autocratic leadership, which doesn't inspire shared thinking, which is not inclusive, that doesn't embrace psychological safety as an attribute, is actually, it's a culture, but it isn't a high-performing culture.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think sometimes from a leadership perspective, you get to a situation where they think there's direction, and there's an assumption that all of the people in that organization, or all of their people in that organization, have a moral compass that's pointing due north, but they don't. Can be fractures or situations where, I guess, people won't follow policy and procedure. I remember seeing a scientific experiment or something on YouTube where, and you've probably seen this one before, where people they've got a doctor's surgery, and they've got the actors are planted in a doctor's surgery, two people, and random genuine patients come to the doctor's surgery in the waiting room, and you've got the two actors, and a beep goes off. And when the beep goes off, they stand up, and then the other two who come in are looking at them. They sit down and they stand up and follow them, and then one of those actors goes through to their appointment. Another new person comes in, and the same thing happens. Eventually, everybody stands up at this beat, but the two actors who were there originally have gone. And when I talk about it in terms of policy and procedure, I say, what happens on the shop floor in organizations is their policies and procedures are set. People assume the controls are being followed. A to B, that was the policy and procedure line. But they're so used to seeing other people do it like this, that as new people come in, everyone just does it like this, and policies and procedures are not being followed. And I think we can assume from, people assume policies and procedures are being followed. And I think that's where you get this situation where employees aren't engaging on policies. And I just wonder if, is the silence on engagement on policies a byproduct of bad culture, where people don't want to take ownership of saying, well, we understand the controls, but they could be better. They always seem to be very top down. Do you think that you need to have more engagement from people doing the doing, building the policies?
Quick answer to that last question is
sorry, it's quite a ramble. Sorry.
Yeah. No. Quick answer to that last question is absolutely yes. If you want to, and in fact, I don't think there's any other way of doing it. I think those that create the policies and the processes should fundamentally be those that are doing the doing, with an input from various other elements like compliance, like risk, like governance, like those that are revenue making. You need input from those in order to be able to. But if you're going to get the buy-in of those that are doing the doing in terms of the implementation, the more administrative functions within an organization, they need to be the ones that have built the procedures. And in fact, that's also part of a three lines defense model, in the fact that compliance and risk is involved in assuring the quality. Well, you can't assure the quality of your own work. The compliance and risk shouldn't have their hands really, really dirty with designing all of the policies, procedures, and controls. But if we take a step back from that, because I think that's a very well trodden path, but if we take a step back from that and we look at this through the lens of kind of culture, we have to ask, well, what is the purpose of a process? What's the purpose of a procedure? What's the purpose of a policy? And it isn't just to hold open the door, all right, or to stack books up against on the shelf. The purpose of a policy or a process or a procedure, or indeed a control that's embedded in those procedures, is to influence human choice. It's simply that, right? It's a method, and it's a well-trodden method. And it's a well-trodden method that regulators will pour their armies through, right, when they come in. Is what are your processes and policies that are implemented in order to influence human choices, human behavior? And I think that's why we need to take a little bit of a step back, because therefore what you're doing is you're actually implementing policies to influence culture.
Yeah, but doesn't it take away? If you say it's to influence, policies and procedures are to influence choice, isn't it taking away choice? It's not, we recommend you do it like this. It's, you have to do it like this. That's our policy and procedure.
And in some instances that might be correct, but in other instances that makes the human choice very challenging, right? Because what you're actually taking away, interestingly, by embedding policies, procedures, and controls, is you're actually extracting accountability.
Yeah, I can draw it like a line from name of the book, Zoe Chance, and she did a book about influences your kind of superhuman power or something, and she said something along the lines of, where you've got an organization where you've got people who are just prescribed to be told to do things a certain way, and you don't give them the remit to make a choice and decide what's the best way to follow that principal direction on a policy, that leads to risk. And she said, so for example, if you came to me and say, I think I'm going to do it this way, what do you think? And I would turn, the way to influence that is I'd turn around to you and say, well, Perrin, what do you recommend? And it's that leaning into allowing people to have choice around a quite a precise direction. And I think that helps influence risk detection in an organization, because it makes people think, well, why would I recommend this? Why would I do this? And what are the risks of it?
Yep, absolutely. So you're talking about a bit of a balance there between what I would call kind of procedure-based decision making and choices, and values and ethics-based decisions and choices. And what we've become in our organizations, and there's no allocation of blame here, but what it's become is it's become overemphasized on a policy and procedure driven culture of essentially influencing human choice, when actually we've got this huge capacity within human beings to make ethical and value-based choices as well. And that's really helpful in an environment when you want to both mitigate risk but also maximize opportunity. So thinking about that kind of, it's not even a trade-off, it's just you can have both, right? You can hold the risk, you can manage the risk, but you can also take the opportunities that sit in front of you. So organizations, for example, that are very much in the high risk space within financial services in jurisdictions in which we might operate here, the whole portfolio of their business is Russia, right?
Waiting for this moment.
So right, and they make a choice that this is the area of business that they wish to work in. There are many other businesses that would completely abstain from having any Russian clients whatsoever. It's just, and so what we can do is we can create cultures and we can create environments where we can actually maximize the opportunities that sit in front of us through the mitigation of risk, through both procedure-based decision-making and cultural-based decision-making.
And I think that by doing that, you can remove that kind of silence trap, which is kind of bit we're drifting through at the moment about, in your experience, and that leads to better voluntary engagement. And does it lead to better kind of reducing the motivations for people to do bad things?
Well, it's encouraging a speak up culture, right? Which is how people might talk about it. And of course, if you look at some of the kind of most recent well-known work around psychological safety done by Google, for example, and they looked over 2-3 year period, they look at what makes their highest performing teams within their organization. And they essentially came up with psychological safety being the key attribute of a high performing team. And the reason for that, again, is because what it was doing was it was encouraging people to express perspectives. The environment was safe in which to express those perspectives. So people could put up their hand when they felt that the direction of travel within that meeting was going in the wrong direction, or a particular decision was not aligned with purpose, or a particular decision might not be aligned with a particular policy or a particular area of risk within that organization. People were able to put up their hands, safely challenge it, have an open discussion around what that looked like, and then move forward with a collective decision. Now, that's the type of culture that you're talking about, which will begin to mitigate and remove silence and encourage speak up, right? But it isn't just about bringing up the things that are potentially negative or riskable. It's actually also being able to put up your hand and say, I think we've got an opportunity over here if we step this way. So it opens the door. Psychological safety is an element that opens the door to maximizing the opportunities as well as mitigating risk.
Yeah. Okay. And with that opportunity, I think at the moment a lot of anyone who's dealing with fraud, financial crime, we're thinking about things around the failure to prevent fraud offence coming in. And one of the issues it talks about in guidance around controls is moving those motivations for fraud. And I do think culture helps people speak up and say, well, there's a risk here, and that could cause someone to do something, or there's a door someone could walk through there and commit some dishonesty. Now, what governance really looks like. Now, look, I think what we haven't referenced is that you've come from a compliance world before. You've worked in compliance, and I think when we think about compliance, we think about governance and we think about risk registers and mitigation and identification of reduction of loss. But as I think governance as a subject kind of gets lost in the written word. I don't know if you agree. You can't capture emotions in words. We can't capture emotions necessarily in images as well sometimes. I think to get buy-in from people, you need some form of an emotional driver. How does that all kind of triangulate, where you've got to get emotional drivers for people to do things, the pull rather than being pushed to do things, governance to work, and culture to help enable that? Is that a triangulation that's possible?
Yes, absolutely. But you've got to understand, I guess, the motives of people, and of groups of people. So that comes back to my kind of earlier comment around, emerging governance frameworks that are probably very much forward thinking in the way that they're looking at organizational governance, placing organizational purpose at the core of essentially the overall makeup of that organization and its participation, both internally and externally, in terms of internally and socially externally, in terms of the environment around it. And if you think about what that represents, then it means that individuals and collections of individuals, be it the board and leadership, be it particular teams, are making decisions in order to move that organization collectively towards that purpose. That's ultimately what they're doing. And in between that purpose and those decisions, there might be strategic aims that crop up every year, or particular goals that organization sets itself. So there's kind of stepping stones on the way towards an aspirational purpose. And if you think that individuals within your organization, they roughly estimate that an individual will make somewhere in the region of 30,000 decisions in a 24-hour period. And of those 30,000 decisions, they estimate that somewhere between 100 to 1,000 decisions in the workplace will have an influence of the direction of travel of that organization towards the aims and purpose of that organization. So once you start calculating and massing that up, an organization is essentially collectively making millions and millions of decisions in any period. So governance, if we take its verb form rather than the noun, is the governing of an organization. And it doesn't just mean the governing at the top, it means the governing all the way through. And interestingly, if you begin to look at perceptions of governance throughout an organization, not just at leadership level, you will see large differences in perspective. And that might be expected, but understanding those differences is key, and that's a lot of our work. But once you've made a decision, you then have to implement a decision. That might be you're the oversight body, you make a decision, or it might be that you're onboarding a particular high-risk client. You've then made a decision to onboard it. You then operationalize that, and then you need particular feedback loops to pick up on the successes or not of that decision. And culture is the piece that draws those two together. Culture is the piece that's saying, well, I actually influence the way in which decisions are made, and indeed the way decisions are made influence me. So there's an exchange between those two. And indeed the way we do things around here influences the overall culture. So that the manifestation of behaviors influences the culture. But equally, the culture is therefore influencing the manifestation of behaviors. So you have got this kind of three aspects that are going on, both inside an organization collectively, but you've got that going on inside groups within that organization. So in teams, in project teams, in leadership teams, you've got this triangle that's going on. But actually, equally, you've got that going on inside yourself individually. So you have an internal culture, you have an internal ethic, you have internal values, you have an internal purpose, right? And these are driving your decisions and indeed the way you do things, which will bring me on to something really interesting, but I want to stop before making sure I've not answered your question, but we're moving in the direction that you want to take this.
Yeah, I think, well, if there's something you wanted to share, feel free as and when. I think, the direction I was going through, that talk of like, if we're all making those hundreds and thousands of decisions and many influence the workday decisions, we've seen where maybe a greater need of that decision-making process, and how culture maybe helps that is important, because there's countless examples of organizations where they've got really good governance, good policies, good procedures, but they've had a fraud event, and it's an internal fraud, it's an insider fraud, it's something's gone wrong, and often it's put down to, well, so it's a bad apple, and it's someone who's an outlier. But I think Coach, you've done a report, or I think you've referenced before to me a report that culture will protect an organization 5 times more than policies and procedures. I was just wondering if you could unpack that, how you got to that conclusion. What's the message in that?
Yeah, okay. A little bit of unpacking then. Okay, so traditional research looks for linear relationships. If I do this, then this happens, like that diagram I showed earlier. A very simplistic view, and we're brought up right from primary school to think in that way. That's why we're taught English and maths and physics and chemistry all separately. When we go to business school, we talk about culture and strategy and sales and marketing and finance, and we're talking about them all separately. And we never actually look at our organizations as interconnected systems. So our research has been saying, and we've been working on this with the Good Governance Academy internationally now for the last 5 years, is there has to be an interconnected relationship between the culture that's pervading an organization and the quality of the governance that's emerging within that organization. But it's not a linear, easy to measure relationship, right? It's a really big challenge to look at. So how do we begin to unpack that? So the first thing to understand is that there's a difference between something that's complicated and something that's complex. And I touched on this a little bit earlier. So imagine a Boeing engine, right? Take the cover off a Boeing engine and look inside it. Incredibly complicated piece of machinery. Many physical moving parts, but an awful lot of electronics and control systems and all this sort of stuff that's going on inside a Boeing engine. All right, put the cover back on. But there's 2 things about it that we know. It's incredibly controllable and incredibly predictable in its outcome. Yeah. All right, but incredibly complicated. But of course, if it wasn't controllable and predictable, we wouldn't get on a plane. Human systems, social systems, and many biological systems and other systems are not just complicated, they're complex, which means that one small input could have many possible outcomes. So it's not like a Boeing engine where one input, we know if we do this, that happens, and that causes that to happen, and that to happen, and that to happen, and that means that we get thrust and away we go. All right. But a human organization is complex. So our approach to this research was saying, well, can we begin to understand what those interrelationships look like? So very quickly, and then we'll move into what the outcomes look like, because I think the outcomes are probably the most interesting feature of it. But essentially, if we look at this diagram here, I'll make this a little bit bigger. Hopefully that's big on everyone's screen. Just let me know if it is. Yeah,
that's good. Thanks.
Okay, so we looked at 3 core aspects. If you look in the middle of these 3 sort of concentric rings and sectors that go from the inside out. So remember I touched on 3 things. Culture, so culture's there in the blue, and decision making is kind of the orange there, and implementation is the yellow color. So you've got these 3 segments that are playing a role in the way in which organizations direct themselves and move themselves towards a purpose. Now, this could either be the organizational wide purpose, or it could equally be the purpose of mitigating fraud risk, right? So you could bring your purpose right back down and say, what's the purpose of us in terms of mitigating fraud risk? We've got a cultural interface here. We've got a decision information, choice information. We've got an implementation. We've got things we can do. And then it goes out in a further 2 layers in what we call categories in the second layer. And then in the final outer layer, we've got essentially 27 factors. So there's 3 in each as we go out. So when you get around to the outside, you've got 27 if your maths is good. And essentially what we were then doing is saying, can we begin to measure and understand of the 27 things that we kind of do each day, moving ourselves towards this purpose, which of the things that we're doing are the most influential on the system quality as a whole? And so what you can see here is that if you look at the size of the sectors generally, and you look at those that we've highlighted here in the two purples, so highly influential and influential, you'll see that in the sector that's blue, the cultural sector, we're seeing 4 highly influential factors feeding into the overall quality of this system. And this system is designed to both mitigate risk and maximize opportunity, whether it's at a very focused scale around fraud or whether it's at a broad scale around overall governance in an organization. Second incoming is the orange, that's decision making. Again, a really broad spread you can see of various factors that are high in terms of the influence on organizational, the quality of the organizational system here. So culture and decision making, hugely influential. But what was really interesting, and this is consistently emerging in our research, and it is beginning to be repeated by others, you'll see that there's one just influential, not even highly influential, one just influential factor in the implementation. Now, the implementation piece is looking at communication, it's looking at training and development, it's looking at policies, procedures and controls, it's looking at compliance and risk monitoring, it's looking at assurance. So you can see that the 2 buckets that we really need to be targeting are around culture and decision making and their interrelationship, and that's what our research has showed. And if you take out the middle and you say, okay, so these are our highly influential factors, what we've also begun to do is begin to understand what these interrelationships look like, the magnitude and the direction of travel of those relationships. So what does it mean in summation? It means, if I stop sharing for a minute, how do I come out here? Here we go, let's stop sharing. What this means in summary, Aaron, is that the culture and its relationship to the way in which we make decisions, irrespective of the policies, procedures and controls that we've got in place, are the 2 most influential factors on moving a group of people towards a particular purpose. And if we drill out and say aspirationally an organization purpose, but we could equally drill in and say the purpose of this group of humans here within the risks function is to mitigate the chances of fraud. That's the purpose. We now need to approach this through this lens of a system, not just siloed, well, we're just going to focus on policy, procedure and controls and frameworks that's so well trodden we kind of believe it's going to work. It needs to be much broader, much wider and much deeper. And yes, you're right, culture and its influence on humans' choice for us is working out to be 5 times more powerful on the quality of that system, the quality of risk prevention, than procedures alone. Yeah.
Which is quite a staggering kind of ratio, isn't it? Taking it to 5 times more important. I think, the other thing I'm taking from the culture is that it can help reduce that, one of the common factors we've seen in, insider fraud, external supplier fraud issues around risk fatigue and monitoring of controls. But I noticed on the outer circle there was, I think it was on implementation, there was something about emotional intelligence. And, we discussed that book from Susan David before about emotional agility, that you can't change how you feel and react, when you have an emotion and what it makes you feel, but you can control what you do with that emotion and the reaction you have to it. So you can deal with the output, you maybe can't control the input. Now, everyone who talks about fraud forever and a day will talk about the fraud triangle and pressure that causes fraud and causes people to do bad things, perhaps. But that pressure starts with an emotion. But my take is that if you can have cultural framework where everyone's looking out for themselves and the organization, that can be the wedge between the emotional reaction and the output, which could be dishonesty. And I'm just wondering, do you buy into that theory that it can be like the intervention between someone maybe feeling like they've got to do something to protect themselves, but they don't go and make that step because they're worried they're going to, they're going to hurt their colleagues who they're really important to them because of the culture. Is that something you're aiming for as an output from your work?
What our work is trying to understand is whether or not and to what effect culture plays a role on improving the governance of an organization and its system. I think our evidence is suggesting really strongly that it does. What you're unpacking here is probably some of the intervention work that we do with organizations following our kind of assessment piece. And you're right, Susan David and many others, Brené Brown and others, all they talk about this separation between essentially a stimulus that is coming from outside. We're required to make a choice, a decision. We're required to respond with some kind of behavior, and separating out the stimulus from our reaction. And the broader we can make that space between something's coming to me and I need to respond, and our reactional response to that. And the wider that gap can be, one can suggest the higher the emotional intelligence of that human. So emotional intelligence plays a role in the choices that we make, without question. But there's a layer beneath that, I think, that's really interesting to just understand, because we talk a lot about emotional intelligence, and in a minute I'll touch on what we talk about in leadership, self-leadership, which is ethical intelligence. And I'll talk about the step from emotional intelligence to ethical intelligence and what that looks like and why that plays a role in the work that we're doing. But the layer underneath emotional intelligence is really fascinating. John Bowlby in the 1980s published a seminal work, and it was called Attachment, and it was looking at it was originally looking at the attachment of the babies born with their mothers early on, and the importance of that attachment in developing secure, emotionally intelligent human relationships in the future. And what his research uncovered is that attachment is the principal driver of our decision making. And actually that driver exists all of our lives. You can rephrase attachment to what often is commonly talked about, senses of belonging. So it's our attachment to a group of humans. And initially that's an attachment to our mothers or a key parental figure. But as we get older, it's our peer groups in school, then it's our working groups within our organizations, etc. But there's another factor that's really interesting, and this is highlighted by the work of Gabor Mate from a sort of psychological and behavioral science perspective, and that is our need for authenticity. So in order for our true well-being as individuals, the more authentic we are, actually the more healthy we are psychologically, physically and physiologically, and those three are all interconnected. So our emotional and physical well-being is indeed very much part of our individual decision-making process as an individual human. So we've got these two things we're holding together: my need to attach, my social need, and then my need for well-being. And what the research has uncovered is that we will sacrifice authenticity for attachment. And we'll almost do this every time. And this will connect, as you'll see in a minute, to why psychological safety is so important for high-performing teams, because psychological safety permits authenticity without the sacrifice of attachment. I can speak up, say what I want, and do that with gentleness and kindness and compassion, but I can say what I want, and I can express my perspective, and I know that my sense of belonging, my actual attachment to that group will not be in threat as a consequence of me speaking up. Now, this is the principal driver for our decision making, because all decisions occur in the limbic brain. So 99% of our decisions occur in our limbic brain, which is our emotional center. So our decisions are based primarily on an emotional need. That emotional need is connected to these two attributes: attachment and authenticity. So our emotional intelligence, this ability to be able to separate the decision that we make from the behavior that we act upon, all right, that emotional gap, is essentially a combination of how we've navigated our need for attachment, how that's manifesting itself in the world around me right now, in this group, this team, this group of individuals, my family, that if I don't bring home what I need, my attachment to my family is in threat. So therefore my sense of belonging is in threat. So I will sacrifice my authenticity, which is normally to be ethical, but my family is at risk. Therefore, this sense of belonging, this group that I am responsible for and connected to, is at threat. So I will sacrifice my authenticity at work because it means that my attachment to that group is maintained. And equally, that can occur within inside an organization. Look at the way in which the Wirecard phenomenon developed, across
Yes.
that, right? That, it began and then it just grew, right? People were creating false accounts in order to be able to meet the targets that they had to remain connected and belong to the group in which they were involved with, the sales group in which they were involved with. So therefore, they participated. So this is the way that human decision making follows. So ethical intelligence, I'm trying to get that full circle, those kind of two ends. Ethical intelligence is saying, I've developed my emotional intelligence to a capacity where I can make choices that means that actually my attachment is being threatened. But I'm so secure in that attachment that I'm prepared to be truly authentic. And I'm prepared to stand up and go, do you know what? We should not be opening these accounts because this is utterly unethical. I may no longer now be part of the sales group of Wirecard, but I have made a stand and I'm likely to get removed from my post. I'll get silenced. I'll get all sorts of things, but I've maintained my position in terms of my ethical intelligence. So culture within groups of humans in the work that we do is saying, can we begin to understand where you individually and where your teams are on a journey towards high performing ethical intelligence? Now, procedures, policies and controls are part of that framework, but so are values, so are understanding human choices, so are the behaviors that are expected and aligned to those values, so are the challenge when those values are not being lived. So aspects that we look at within our framework are emerging as far more important and influential than policies and procedures alone. Yeah.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think that idea that you can, it goes back to speaking up, I suppose, as well, but also, the feeling of disenchantment for an employee that if they feel they can't speak up and therefore they can't be authentic and then they take attaching to the organization instead, that leads to risk. I know Paula could probably put it in the chat. We did a white paper quite a while ago about this theory of the alternative fraud triangle, which is leadership sets the culture, but if the culture is fractured, people tend to become disenchanted. And if people are disenchanted, they do the right thing for them rather than the right thing, and that creates fraud risk. And I think there is I like the synergy there with that kind of ability to retain security in terms of oneself feeling I'm secure at my organization, no matter if I speak up, and authenticity. And that kind of takes us to theory and practice. There is an individual, hopefully I'll get him on one of these episodes, Patrick Wright, who is leads on ethics and integrity for a environmental organization called WSP, and he deals with UK, Ireland and Israel, I think, as well. And he came and spoke at an event we hosted a year or so ago, and he talked about whistleblowers, and the challenge for whistleblowers is that you have to stand in their shoes. They have to report on a compliance failing or a potential compliance failing, a breach of the law. And he said, what happens if they instead had to report where they saw the risk of a breach of ethics, principles or values? And he said there's much more intrinsic motivation and a much more buy-in for people to see risk and talk about things around the corners as well as what's in front of them if they're seeing risks on breach of ethics, culture, values and principles. And it's easier for them to report that than it is on grasping on someone who may have potentially committed a breach of the law. And I've seen that work as a really good, or he's advocated for that. It's been a really good cultural phenomenon in that organization for how people do things around there. Have you got any good examples of where you've seen, right, this is great? You and me have talked a lot about culture and theory and books, and we've talked about, systems and so on. What have you seen it really work in practice? Where have you seen a business go from maybe risk to being safe? That includes fraud controls, but generally through culture being the driver.
Yeah. So our approach is to observe the system, understand the interplay, make recommendations around key themes. Yeah. So of the 27, this is a key theme. So, those themes will emerge. And then many of you will have heard of the butterfly effect. So Edward Lorenz back in the 1970s, when he was observing weather systems, and he came up with this kind of a bit of a metaphor, but I think we all get it. A butterfly flaps its wings in North Carolina, and you get a tornado in Western Europe. And so a small change can result in a macro change. So what we're interested in, and this is all part of the work that we do, and why it's probably so fascinating, is that organizations spend hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds collectively across the year trying to mitigate risks and maximize opportunities. But let's focus on the mitigation of risk. And they often do this through big programs of change, right? So that they rewrite their whole policy, procedures, and framework, or they implement a whole new risk mitigation system, or it's a big effort. It's like we're gonna invest in this, and if we put lots of time, money, and effort in this, we'll get a big outcome. But actually, because groups of humans, organizational systems are complex, actually you can get magnified effects as a consequence of small changes. And this is the basis of obviously looking at behavioral science and behavioral nudge theory. So if you it's something that many of you may have heard of. So this small changes in your human choices during a day can have ultimate big effects on your health or on your finances or what have you. So small effects can be magnified. And so what we've been interested in over the last sort of 3-4 years working with organizations is, once we've identified this is the area that we think you should be looking at, it's the one that had the most impact. Yeah, that little array that I showed you in that diagram. But within that aspect, that let's say it's around embedding values into behaviors, right, which does emerge relatively frequently as being influential. Are there small things that we can do that encourages that within organizations that do not cost millions of pounds to intervene, but actually see significant ripple effects across an organization that's magnified? And the answer is yes. One example that we saw in an organization, they came to us 18 months ago. We measured their governance. We came back with our 3 recommendations. They said that's brilliant. So that was 3 out of 27. They came in and they worked on one of those. One of those was indeed embedding values and trying to elicit better behaviors that were aligned with values. And they did a couple of very small things. The first thing was that in every single meeting, at the beginning of the meeting, they reminded themselves of what the values were of the organization. Simple, right? These are our values. Just remember, these are our values. All right. And they had 5. All right. Whether you have 2 or 5 or 10 or whatever it is, we would suggest less than 5, but however many values you've got. Just remind ourselves. We all got that. Brilliant. That's it. And then we move into the meeting. And then at the end of the meeting, we get them to say, which values have we utilized? And those in the meeting just went around and gave a personal score. They didn't need to share this, right? Didn't need to share it, didn't need to tell anyone. Just reflect, give yourself a personal score. That's the first thing. Second thing we did was with meetings that were of managerial level or above, we got them to reflect not on values, but on direction of the meeting towards purpose. So at the beginning of the meeting, what's the purpose of the organization? Not necessarily the purpose of the meeting, purpose of the organization. And then at the end of the meeting, that whether it's a leadership team or senior management, they had to write a 3-sentence thing. How has these decisions moved us towards our purpose? Well, they have met this, met that. That's all they did. Right? That's all they did. Okay. That cost nothing.
Right? And was the output was a positive output, I guess.
The output is that we obviously saw an uplift in the way in which purpose and values were being embedded. But because of the interconnections of that throughout the system, we saw of the 26 remaining elements, 21 of them went up. Right. So when we were measuring the overall governance of this organization over a 12-month period, the quality of their governance as measured by our tool had gone up by 7%.
Well, I guess we take from that focus and small changes perhaps into how you improve your culture can have much wider benefit and implications.
Well, without question, yeah.
Which is a good way to end. Well, Perrin, that hour's gone very quickly. Thank you very much for giving up your time, and everyone who's been with us on the call. I didn't really feed in much time for questions, so I know we've had one point about there's endless examples of serious corporate failures with no board level individuals held to account, HSBC, Rolls-Royce, Airbus, and various others. Are we missing an opportunity on impact and culture? And I think we are. Culture can be, as I say, looking around corners and stopping things before they happen. So Perrin, look, thank you very much for joining us, and everyone who's attended today. There's a feedback form that's posted in the chat. If you've got any time just to fill that in for us, it's really helpful. We send a copy of the recording out to those who have attended or have registered, as well as a PDF, ebook, flipbook to explain what's I have to keep dancing. Explain our key points we've taken from today. We've got another episode coming up, but we're going to take a little break over the summer. So the link for that next episode is going to be in the chat. That's about insuring the invisible. We're going to talk about fraud insurance, and I'm going to be with Vikshay Vijay, a certified fraud examiner and fraud and crime leader at Allianz Trade. And that's going to be on Tuesday, the 9th of September at midday. And we're going to talk about how we're probably missing a trick in terms of ensuring fraud risk. So beyond that, I think I'll try and give everybody 2 minutes of their day back. But thank you everyone who's stuck around and attended the session. For those watching back, thank you for giving up your time. And I hope you've enjoyed the session. Please reach out to Perrin and see what CoSteer can do and try and help your organization. Many thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.